Hi, this is Dan from Binaural Recording Sights and Sound. And let you guys know that I did come back from the game On Expo and we did get some cool captures of the panels that were at the event. However, the binaural parts of it didn't actually turn out. So these recordings that you're going to see here are actually just going to be just the recordings, just with the production value and the things that I've added to it. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Take a watch.
Okay. There's a lot less people in here, and that makes me feel a lot more at ease. So welcome. My name is Jacob V. I go by Print Bash Props on Instagram. I am a competitive and craftsmanship cosplayer. I have been competing in masquerades since 2018. No, I've been competing solo since 2018. I was competing in groups since 2016. And I've had work in San Diego Comic-Con. I've had work at New York Comic-Con. I've had work in Denver Comic-Con. I've had different pieces from different clients placed in multiple masquerades around the country. I'm not trying to brag, but I have been doing this for a few years, and these are the specific and exact techniques that I have used to win awards in masquerades and for craftsmanship in general. Are all of you guys competitive cosplayers at all, or no? Cool, which means you won't have competing opinions. So, before we begin, are there any questions in general? No, cool, okay. So this is my disclaimer. This is basically all full of my opinions. This is my personal lived experience in my own competitive journey. Masquerades and event judging are subjective and inconsistent at best. Find what works for you and your crafting capacities and match your ideal aesthetics. Any of the following techniques that I'm about to show you will help you earn points in competition for well-finished prints. So take what you learn here, improve upon it. I'm not perfect, make it your own. Take what I'm giving you and do better, and then I can learn from you too. But with the nature of competition, different competitions value different things for their prize winners. And so I remember very vividly when I first started competing, there was a gentleman that competed at Tucson Comic-Con, I think in 2016, in Bioshock, in a Bioshock costume where it was like an old-timey diver that had lights and animatronics and bubbles and fog and like all of this really beautiful stuff, and he took home Best in Show from Tucson Comic-Con. And then he went to Phoenix Comic-Con that same year, back when it was still Phoenix Comic-Con, now it's Phoenix Fan Fusion. He won nothing, not even a judge's award. So if you lose in a masquerade or a competition, it's nothing personal. It's just what those judges in that particular competition valued. So take that and go compete again. But that's my disclaimer. I'm not saying you're going to win a masquerade for doing this. I'm just saying that this is what I do. The foundation of making a competitive piece is your physical print. I almost exclusively use PETG for my competitive pieces. In my previous panel, I talked about what's called a glass point, and that's the point at which the plastic becomes soft. PETG is a petrol product. It's what soda bottles are made out of, and so it will retain its rigidity in high temperature environments for a longer period of time. I have brought PETG props down here, and it has not warped. It hasn't caused problems. It's also way easier to sand than like PLA or other kinds of filaments, and it takes primer really, really nicely. But again, that depends on what you're making for that particular convention or that particular piece. I have a costume that has a light up horn on the forehead. It's Helios from Sailor Moon. And because it was such a small piece and I had multiple pieces together and it had an armature inside of it for holding LEDs, that was printed out of PLA because I wanted the structural rigidity on the outside for me to sand it smooth, whereas PETG might flex more under that heat. Does that make sense? But then additionally, if you need something that's like hard and pointed, some conventions will not allow you to bring a hard plastic sharp object in. And so you have to craft for that audience. And you would need to use something soft, like a foam, or print in a plastic called TPU, which is a thermoplastic polyurethane. And that will remain flexible and soft. And there's different techniques for finishing TPU than there are for other like PETG type prints. So you basically need to pick your materials that are appropriate for the convention that you're attending, and then go from there. You're going to spend a lot of time sanding. Sorry about it. I live and breathe sanding entirely too much. It's like ironing when you're sewing. If you're not sanding, you're not ironing, you're not making your stuff look good. And that's just my opinion. If you like the way that your raw prints look, that's great. That's valid. You do you. I love smooth sanded prints. The pieces that I typically use are a Ryobi cordless mouse sander, which if you look on the, oh, it doesn't even have the battery in this one. I think it was about $60 that I got off of Amazon, and it has its own charging system, but it's just like a little like drill battery that plugs into the back, and it will let me sand for maybe like 20, 30 minutes, and then I'll swap it out for another battery. It has a removable Velcro pad on the front of it, so you take different grits and then you work up through the grits kind of thing. It starts with, I think, 80 grit sandpaper and then moves all the way up to 240. And so I will typically start with my raw print and sand the whole thing with 80 grit and get as much of those layer lines away as possible. And then I will swap to 120, and then I'll sand the whole thing again. And then I'll take it and I'll wet sand it with 400 grit sandpaper just by hand. And then I begin my filling process. But before we talk about that, I also use, it's not Dremel brand, but it's a rotary tool, a Dremel tool. And I use diamond bits, which are like drum bits that you can get off of Amazon that have physical diamonds embedded into them, and it sands anything you could ever possibly want. And that's good for like smoothing. But then if you have like problem areas of your prints where there's blobs or like your support material didn't come off very well, I use a wire brush head, and that's literally just like a wire brush that spins at a high velocity, and it takes stuff out quick. It's dangerous, but it gets work done. So any questions about those in particular? Yes?
Would you use the wire brush for like heavy stringing?
No, I actually heat treat for heavy stringing. I also have I'll get to you in just a moment. I have a Ryobi brand, I just like Ryobi, they're reliable, but I have a Ryobi brand heat gun that has a wide base on the bottom, so you can turn it on and it faces straight up.
Okay.
I think it was about $70 from Harbor Freight, but there's probably cheaper options on Amazon. I turn that on and I turn it all the way up, and then I will like glance the 3D print in and out of the heat stream until those strings disappear.
Okay, so one of the reasons that I hate sanding is because of the mess.
Mm-hmm.
What is your setup as far as space goes?
So it's not fancy. I have a table set up outside that has 2 old pillowcases that I sewed together and cut apart to make like a big sheet. And I have that stapled to a wooden table outside. And so I will do almost all of my sanding outside, except my wet sanding that I do at my kitchen sink. We've got like a big basin sink, something, I don't know what she's made out of, it's metal. So I'll do as much of my sanding outside as possible, and then I can just like brush it off and then not deal with it. And then with the wet sanding, you don't really want to be flushing microplastics down your drain. So I will fill the tub or like the basin with water, maybe just like a couple inches, and you want lukewarm water and just a little bit of dish soap. And that causes the surface tension to act differently, and it will physically grab onto the plastic particles. And as you're wet sanding, that plastic, one, floats to the top, but they clump together, and then you can take a paper towel and wipe it off. The only other thing that I have is an old lamp from Goodwill. It's like one of those brass lamps that had the 3 sections in it and then the top unscrews, and it has a hole in the top. And I take a wire hanger, and I don't have photos of this because it's awful, but I take a wire hanger and I shove the wire hanger in the hole out of the top of that old lamp, and I use that as like an in-air suspension hook, and I can put larger prints on top of that, and then it can reach all sides at once when I'm putting primer down. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So, oh wow, we're going quick here. Wet sanding. Wet sanding is the secret sauce that makes your prints look good. I like to use a high grit sandpaper for this. Anything less than 400, you're kind of not doing a lot of work because you're doing the wrong kind of work, I guess I should say, because 400 and higher are polishing type sandpapers. Anything under than that, you're taking chunks away. So there are certain kinds of sandpaper that are made specifically for wet sanding. You need to double check that they are specifically wet sanding. Otherwise, the adhesive that holds the grit on will come off as you're sanding it, and that's not a good time. It makes a gummy mess, and you don't like it. But that's literally what it sounds like. You use lukewarm. I like to use a more hot water because I'm insane. But you use water and a little bit of dish soap. I use Dawn brand, and that allows you to get very little friction as you're sanding your piece down, and it makes your pieces glass smooth. It's incredible. I also use a set of diamond needle files from Harbor Freight. They're super cheap. I think they're like $12 a pair or $12 for a set of 10. I will go through a set a year because they eventually fill up with primer and Bondo, but they're cheap, they're disposable, and they do so much good work, and they come in a variety of profiles in this pack, so you can get into like holes and crevices and lines and like all this kind of crazy stuff, and you don't need to do a ton of work to get those problem areas because they're diamond files. And then another secret, this is genuinely a secret of mine that I have not spoken about publicly ever. Finish your sanding with melamine sponges. Do you guys know what Mr. Clean Magic erasers are? Those are melamine sponges. They're literally just like foam sponges that are 4,000 grit sandpaper. That's how they clean. They're not actually cleaning, they're sanding your surface down. So think about that. But when you are ready for your final layers of primer, or you have finished priming and you are prepping for paint, I buy an off-brand because they're cheaper. I don't even remember what brand it is, but it's literally just a melamine sponge, and you take it with water only and you scrub down your surfaces, and it takes off the last little bit of eggshelling and it makes it perfectly smooth. Take that to the bank. That's my one secret here. Any questions? Cool. So translucent finishes, these are particularly hard to get through because one wrong move and you have to start all the way over from the beginning again. In most cases, you'll be using an FDM print because resin never truly cures white or clear. By nature, UV resin cures yellow. Not totally yellow, but like a yellow hue. And unless you are willing to like take time to mix a very pale lavender clear resin to offset the yellow, because yellow is opposite from purple on the color wheel, you're going to want to stick with something like a PLA or a PETG when you print for pieces that need light to pass through it or translucency. This is this giant kyber crystal is a part of a display that I have on my table, so if you would like to get a closer look at it. The thing is like a foot tall and it comes apart, and I've got kyber crystals inside of it. Come buy them, they're $5. But that thing on the right is the horn for a Helios cosplay that I recently made. And instead of adding filler anywhere on that, I sanded it down with progressively higher grits of sandpaper until the layer lines were completely gone. And then I used an airbrush to paint it with Plat FX paint. And Plat FX is a little bit more watery than typical acrylic, and it has like something inside of it that makes it flexible, so it goes on very smooth and very thin. And that allowed the LED lights that I put inside of it to still shine through even during the day. But my main tips with that is you should exclusively wet sand, because wet sanding does more work than dry sand, if that makes sense. The only problem with wet sanding is that it's more cumbersome because you need a source of water, and it's wet, and if you live up in Prescott like me, the water gets cold quickly and then it turns into a mess, and I don't like it. But wet sanding will net you a smoother finish quicker than dry sanding, but you can't always wet sand everything. But if you don't want to take the time to sand down everything first, you can start by doing UV cure resin or an epoxy style resin. Additionally, remember that UV resin will yellow. All resins will yellow with time, but UV resin yellows first. So mix a little bit of purple dye into it if you want to, or just pick something that's yellow toned and then no one's gonna notice. Tomorrow, I'm gonna be wearing a costume that I have shoulder pieces on that have no sanding on them, but look smooth because I used UV resin to cure it, or UV resin to smooth it, if that makes sense. The only caveat to this particular method is that whatever resin you use needs to have a low temperature cure for it. Some resins can get up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit as they're curing, and that will cause your print to warp underneath it, and then you have an ugly mess on your hands. And if you do UV resin in very thin coats, you don't have to struggle with that. I use Amazing brand resin, which I believe is available on Amazon. I think you can also get it from Reynolds Advanced Materials, but I typically just buy it from Hobby Lobby. It's like a tabletop resin, so it's meant to go over large surfaces, which means that it is a low volatile reaction and it will take upwards of 24 hours to cure. So you can put it on and it will not cause your prints to warp. Additionally, you want to put a clear coat every single time when you're doing translucent finishes. Some people, if you want something glossy, you can use additional resin, or you can use a product called polyacrylic. Polyacrylic is a spray finish that's available at most hardware stores and on Amazon. That takes 30 days to a full cure, so you have to do this well ahead of time or you're going to have problems with it. But it comes in both a acrylic and a oil base. I use the water vehicle acrylic base for this, and it, other than having problems with the nozzle clogging sometimes, gives you a flawless finish every single time. An additional item that isn't talked about often in the cosplay community is a product called Mr. Super Clear. Mr. Super Clear is used in toy customization circles, typically with gunpla kits or doll modification, like doll face-ups and doll customization. It is a resin-like spray material that leaves a textured surface. It comes in both a matte and a super gloss. If you want a matte finish, you want Mr. Super Clear UV flat, which is different from UV flat cut. The cut makes it flexible and ideal for vinyl surfaces, so you don't need to spend the extra money on the UV flat cut. But Mr. Super Clear is great for matte finishes. Rust-Oleum also makes a couple different spray finishes. There's a clear acrylic enamel that they sell. You have to only use Rust-Oleum products with that though, because it will cause what's called orange peeling, which is where the paint over it starts to cure, and then your stuff underneath it will react to the vehicle and it lifts. And because the top is curing, it doesn't have anywhere to go, so it buckles and folds underneath it and it looks like orange skin. Additionally, and some people roast me for this, but Mod Podge has spray product that provide certain kinds of finishes. Like there's a pearlizing medium from Mod Podge that I used on my Helios cosplay for pearlized finishes, and it rocks and it sets hard. But there's lots of different things that you can use to finish your translucent your translucent pieces. Any questions? Cool. This is something that I have not seen a lot of people talk about, but it is one of my favorite things to do. You do not need to buy resin in multiple colors. You can dye your finished resin 3D prints, and you can dye like your resin casts as well. In this case, we're just going to be talking about dyeing resin for 3D printing. The correct way to do it is adding resin dye. Specifically, I use So Strong brand from Reynolds Advanced Materials, but most resin dyes will work. You would mix it into the resin that you put into your printer, and because your printer is inherently moving with every layer, it keeps the solution properly mixed, and it nets you a very clean product. The only problem though is that the FEP film that's on the bottom of your resin printer, which is like a clear film that the UV light passes through to cure your layers, it can stain if you use too much or the wrong kind of resin. Additionally, if you don't make enough of your resin and you run out, it's almost impossible to color match perfectly. What I like to do, and I don't know if there's a name for this because people don't really talk about it, I call this post-print resin dyeing, but you basically make whatever it is you want out of resin, out of clear resin, and then you can use heat and dye to change that final color. It is toxic, it is messy, and it takes practice, so you need to take proper precautions, use items only for dyeing, and use a mask, and use gloves.
I have a question for that.
Yes?
So, what's the difference between doing that and just painting it?
The difference is that these are translucent finishes, and so if you have a translucent paint, that works well, but this is using resin dye to get like really exact custom results. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. So you begin by boiling a pot of, oh, yes?
Sure. So you mentioned that if you're not careful, your resins will kind of come out yellow, like a clear resin. Will that hinder the dyeing process, or is that kind of beneficial?
It depends on what color you're doing. Everything will yellow with time, but using a quality brand of resin will prevent yellowing typically, well, prevent some yellowing. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered that question well. Thanks. But this is the exact process I use. Yes, sir.
I've already done that and it came out yellowish. Is there a way to not, or take the yellowish away? Is it too late?
So, in that situation, you would probably need to sand down your print and then apply a new layer of resin finish on it. But again, dye it just ever so slightly purple, like very, very pale violet, and that will help counteract the yellow tones in it. But realistically, resin's yellow at different rates, and so it's really hard to tell without knowing your exact position, your exact situation. Come by my table and we can talk more intimately about that. Okay, but to do this specific technique, you start by boiling water. You want enough water to fully submerge your print. Use a non-porous container. I used a glass baby food jar that was left over. A sacrificial brush, because once you put this brush in dye, it will bleed dye for the rest of your life. Not the rest of its life, the rest of your life. And I just used a paper plate as my work surface. You begin by coating your pieces in the dye. You just take your brush and you totally coat them in it. You want to oversaturate this top layer of resin. And then you chuck that in your hot water bath for 5 to 15 minutes, depending on your brand of resin dye. And that opens the pores of the plastic and the resin, and it allows the dye to seep into that topmost layer. The nice thing about this is that it allows you to exactly control the amount of hue you're adding to your translucent finish. If you go too far, use an acetone-soaked rag, and you can pull some of the dye off. So if you look closely, those two crystals there are different colors. The one on top with the support material still attached is the color it was when I removed it from the dye bath. The color on bottom is what happened after I wiped it down with acetone to get the color I wanted. And once you get the color you want, you dunk it in cold water and let it sit for a couple of minutes until it's totally cold through. And that makes the pores of the plastic close up and hold on to that dye. The only caveat with this is that you have to add a clear coat, point blank period. If you do not add a clear coat, it will continue to bleed dye every time that you touch it. I like to use polyacrylic on mine, and it's a spray. You roll it, spray, roll it, and it totally finishes the whole thing. You can also use clear UV resin or etc. Do you have a question? Yeah? No, it looked like you had a question. Does anyone else have questions?
No. I want to point out that you're selling these for $5 at your table.
Oh yeah, these are I have blind bags of kyber crystals from Star Wars at my table if you would like to come and see what the Force says your color is. I think I'm running a little short on time, but let's see if we can get through this. So, your typical body shopping materials. Rust-Oleum brand automotive primer spray. It's less expensive than Duplicolor, which is the other most common used body filler, but it takes 24 hours to set to what I like to call bone dry. Bone dry is where you can take any kind of sandpaper and start to sand on it and it will powder off. So if you're going to use Rust-Oleum, it does take a few more layers because the actual filler material inside of it is not as intense, and the vehicle takes 24 hours to set. Duplicolor is more expensive. I believe it's made by Sherwin-Williams, to be entirely honest. But the cool thing about it is that if you don't need to do a ton of sanding on your piece, you can do layers of Duplicolor within about 20 or 15 minutes if you use a heat gun. So you can spray and then cure and then spray and then cure within minutes. And you can do 4 or 5 layers of primer in the span of an hour. It's incredible. Additionally, Bondo Step 2 Body Putty from Bondo. It's like a red toothpaste looking thing that you can squeeze out and then apply to your print in thin layers to fill up most of those layer lines. It can be thinned with acetone to get even thinner results, and you can brush it on. I personally don't like to do that because dealing with acetone and having to make more waste is a problem for me. So I use a silicone scraper. Mine is from JamieRayVintage.com because they're friends of mine and I was supporting them. But there's like cheap silicone spatulas that you can get from the dollar store or Amazon that you can use to scrape on this Bondo and get it in really thin layers. So any questions about those before we get into my workflow?
Can you go back one more?
Of course. Okay. We good? Cool. So my exact body shopping workflow. I start with my raw print. I apply Bondo, and then I sand with low grit sandpaper, typically under 100 grit. Then once that has been totally sanded, I move on to 200 grit. And then depending on how much work that piece needs, I'll repeat that maybe up to 300. Then I spray my first layer of primer. I let that set, and then I'll go over it again with another 200 grit or higher. I typically use 400 and I wet sand at that point. And then I repeat adding a layer of primer, and I do that over and over and over again, repeating steps 6, 7, and 8 until it reaches the final smoothness that I want. This here, can you see my mouse when I move it?
Yes.
Cool. So this here is the scraper that I use. It's literally just like a firm silicone piece, and I can put Bondo in roughly in the area that I want, and then I use this piece like a paintbrush, and it spreads it really, really thin, and it makes your Bondo last a lot longer and you cover a larger surface. Additionally, Bondo does not like to go on thick. The thicker your Bondo layer, 1, the more brittle it becomes, but 2, the longer it takes to dry, and it's prone to cracking. So thick Bondo chunks will crack on you, and it's easier and better to do thin layers. Any questions about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said Bondo is toxic, right? So
Yes.
You have to wear a mask.
Yes.
Do you have to wear gloves too? Or?
If you're not directly touching it, you don't need to. That's why I use the silicone scraper. But it would probably be best to wear gloves every time you handle it.
Okay.
I don't always do best practice, but it is toxic.
Okay.
Okay, now we're going to talk about enamel bases. This is also something that not a lot of people talk about.
That's my hand.
Yes, this is, are you sure about that?
Yeah, pretty sure.
Are you sure about that?
It might be yours, but
Since
like,
when
I
do you
thought,
have
like,
man hands, young lady?
That could be my hand.
These are her props, if that wasn't obvious. After I have done all of that body shopping, I then use a Rust-Oleum enamel base. It is a oil enamel that you can spray onto your pieces, and because it's oil-based, it takes a significant amount of time to set, but it self-levels, and you can get perfect mirror finishes using Rust-Oleum enamel. Additionally, if you spray too far away, you can get an eggshell texture because the globs of paint are not close enough to fuse together. So you can get a very lightly textured finish if that's what you're interested in. The only caveat is that Rust-Oleum's particular, what they use to thin it down to make it sprayable is not entirely compatible with some brands of paint. So you need to have a test piece. Some people use plastic spoons and they'll just spray all of their intended pieces, like the layers they intend to do on this plastic spoon to see how the paints react with each other. But I think that's pretty much that. Any questions about enamel? Okay. This is a original Power Rangers helmet that I had made for KK Ninja, Ryan K, if you guys have heard of her. This thing was a beast, but there's not a single layer line on it because of the enamel smoothing. The only major drawback to using Rust-Oleum enamel is that it takes a full 30 days to a hard cure. I learned the hard way with my Bo-Katan helmet that if you take a prop from Prescott down to Phoenix before the enamel has had its full 30 days, it will start to crack. So it made like these really strange Y-shaped cracks, and it was upsetting at the time, and it looks like weathering, so I'm okay with it now. But if it goes from cold climates to hot climates and it has not fully set, it will off-gas, where it allows some of that acetone vapor to escape through the pores of the paint, and then it cracks and ruins your finishes. So if you're going to use this, you have to plan ahead. Yes?
So does that mean that it's vulnerable to like changes in weather in the same place as well?
Only if those changes in weather are like from one season to another, like say that you're going from winter into spring, that might be a problem. Otherwise, keep it in a controlled environment. So like if you have a closet or a pantry or somewhere that's dry and, well, I guess not ventilated, it doesn't need ventilation, but dry and safe, you can leave that piece in there for 30 days and it will set.
Okay, but for, like now we're in monsoon season, doing it on a hot day and then getting rain the next day where it cools down a lot, that would ruin it?
No.
No?
It's okay to go from hotter to cold. It's not okay to go from colder to hot.
I suppose, yeah, then it going back to hot after the rain's done.
Yeah, but again, if you keep it in the same environment, the problem was that I left my colder environment into a hotter environment in a car. But if I had just kept that helmet in the same place for 30 days, even though there's fluctuations in temperature, it would have been fine. I guess as long as you have air conditioning, like your piece isn't gonna suffer that much. Just don't leave it in like a shed outside or something where it will be affected by the heat in those 30 days. Does that answer everyone's questions? Okay. As a rule, I use black enamel for my metallics. It doesn't matter whether it's silver, gold, bronze, etc. There's something about black that metallic paint really likes, and it adds additional depth, and you typically only have to do 1 or 2 coats of your metallic to get a realistic metal finish. I use white for basically everything else. The only exception to that is when I'm doing something that has an orange finish, I use a yellow enamel base because orange does not like to layer up, period. There's something about the way that those pigments sit. So if you do a yellow base first for your orange, it makes your orange pop. Rust-Oleum enamel also does not need a clear coat. It is a hard shell enamel, and it sets hard after 30 days. So unless you are putting something on top of it, you do not need to clear coat your enamel. So that's one point in that direction. So any questions there? Cool. Gold leafing. I talked about this in my last panel just a little bit, but gold leafing is one of my favorite techniques. This is Bakura's Millennium Ring from Yu-Gi-Oh! I use those exact same techniques. I used Bondo and body filler to make it really nice and smooth. I then used black enamel to get my base surface, and then I used Plaid brand liquid leafing to do this. It basically takes gold leaf, powders it, and then puts it in this red alcohol vehicle so you can paint it on with a brush. And it's way, way easier than using the traditional method of a spray adhesive or like a glue, and then you tap in the gold leaf sheets. That takes me so much longer, and I don't like the results quite as much as this. Are there any questions about gold?
Where do you find that liquid leaf?
Liquid leaf is available on Amazon. You can also get it from most crafting stores, typically in the scrapbooking section. In a pinch, I'll go get it at Hobby Lobby, but I like to buy mine from Amazon because you can get larger bottles from Amazon. It's also significantly cheaper than buying gold leaf sheets because they can take the pieces that they've ruined, making gold leaf, and grind it down. So a bottle of gold leaf is typically about $8, whereas a like book of sheets will be 20 to 30.
I always felt like the sheets were such a waste.
Because you can't do anything with your offcuts.
Right.
Exactly. So that's why I like this. It's easier and has less waste. The only caveat, though, is that the red alcohol that they use to suspend the leaf evaporates very, very quickly. So you'd have to dip your brush, cap it, and then paint. And then you have to use a strong detergent to clean out your brush, unless you want to throw your brush away every single time. I used Dawn dish soap.
What was the brand one more time?
Plaid. It looks like this. Plaid brand liquid leaf. It comes in gold, antique gold, silver, and bronze. This is one of my favorite techniques. This is multicolor 3D printing. This is not really something that you can do unless you have a 3D modeling program. And these are examples of evolution coasters that I'm selling at my booth if you want to come take a closer look at this exact technique. But essentially, you paint by numbers. You make your 3D model in such a way that each of these pieces print for each color on that first layer. And then as you go back through and print each piece, they fuse to each other. So in the end, you get a totally scratch-resistant, chip-proof finish. And if you print it thin enough, you can flex it around certain pieces for like pauldrons or armor. But each of these coasters were printed full color using that technique. This could be a panel in and of itself. The only major drawback is that you have to be able to 3D model, and it takes a huge amount of pre-planning to do. Yes?
What software would you use for 3D modeling? Just Blender, or would it have to be more of a CAD software?
So I'm partial to Fusion 360 by Autodesk. You can get it for free using a hobbyist license as long as you make less than $100,000 a year on your modeling or 3D printing. Otherwise, it's about $375 a year for a license. Yeah, but that's what I learned to model in, and so that's what I'm most comfortable in. I also work in Blender. This kind of modeling is most successful in Fusion 360. I have a panel on modeling in Fusion 360 on Sunday if you guys are interested in coming. So the next thing is textured finishes. This is the kind of stuff that I go to if I'm still competing and I don't have enough time to do perfectly smooth stuff. Textured finishes can add a lot of visual interest to your prints, and it's good for getting particular aesthetics, but in many cases you will lose points compared to your competitors for them having spent more time sanding and smoothing their pieces because of the time investment alone. So this is more of a craftsmanship and less of a competitive portion of this panel, if only because you may lose points as compared to other competitors. This is one of my favorites. I call this Bondo dabbing. You basically just take a ripped paper towel and roll it up like a brush, and then you dip it into your red Bondo putty, and then you can dab it onto your piece, and it makes it have a stucco or stone-like appearance. It dries in like minutes because the Bondo is so thin. If that is too textured for you because it's Bondo, you can take sandpaper and just sand it down to be more like sandstone, like what I've done here with this little Boba Fett throne. So if you look here, this kind of dark green teal area is the raw print, and then this red stuff is the Bondo, and I've literally just like brushed it on and then dabbed to make it rough. Any questions about that? Cool. This is one that I have tried and only had success once with, and it was done during a con crunch, and this is not that photo. I don't have photos of that piece anymore. But this is snow texture paste, which is taken from the tabletop model community. You take equal parts of white paint, PVA glue, and baking soda. And this creates a textured snow that they would brush on the bases for their miniatures. Turns out that you can just put it on anything and they don't tell you that. It's fun. But you just put this on there and you let it dry, and it will set with like a rough kind of texture. But then if you take a heat gun and you activate the baking soda with the heat gun, the baking soda puffs. It like blows up and it turns into a fluffy, soft texture. It's wild. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I want to revisit this because I went too hard and I made my prints warp because this was done with PLA. And when you overheat PLA, it releases the internal pressure, the internal stresses that come from printing. So your piece will elongate and shrink, if that makes sense. It gets taller and skinnier. Don't we all wish that? But this is what those pieces look like before I destroyed them. Great, right? Cool, yeah, I'll do that again one day. But any questions about that technique? Okay. So glitter finishes. This is a little controversial, and if you guys disagree with me, that's great. Glitter is the one thing that will hide your sins instantly. Your layer line's gone, dead in a ditch. The way that I like to do it is using glitter to enhance a final layer. So it's typically a very fine glitter that gets coated. But there is a technique called glitter packing, where you cover your piece in adhesive of some kind, and then you dunk it. You just dunk that thing in glitter. And it totally covers your finish, like your print lines entirely in seconds. I typically use Super 77, which I believe might be made by Plaid. It's a very old bottle and it's mostly worn off, so I don't remember. But you spray your piece with the spray adhesive, and then you hold it over like a container or something to catch the loose glitter. You dump the glitter over it while rotating the piece to totally cover everything, and then you can pat that down to ensure adhesion. And then after that's dried, you take a brush or something, brush off your excess glitter, and then put on a clear coat to keep that glitter from falling off. But these pieces here, they look finished and beautiful, and I'm happy with them. They have zero sanding on them, but it's not something that I would personally enter into a competition, because if anyone knows their stuff and I get caught, I'm gonna lose points. This is what I prefer to do. This is a glitter top coat. So if you look really closely on this, this headdress from Omega from Star Wars Bad Batch, these darker areas, this is a graphite glitter that was applied just to those areas. This is a gold, or no, this is a iridescent? Yeah, that's an iridescent. That was applied on top of a yellow Rust-Oleum enamel. And then we've got a gold top coat here. This center gem here is Mod Podge Pearlizer, and then more of the gold. And so these are finish enhancing techniques that will net you points. These are done on properly body shopped pieces, and it's not hiding anything underneath. And so you can go very light just to catch, like the stage lights as you're competing. This is one that I've done too that I really love and is getting a little bit more traction in the cosplay community. This is a Pokeball that I made back in, I think, 2017 using brocade fabric. So I basically just covered my Pokeball pieces in a thick layer of Aleene's tacky glue, and I cut my fabric pieces on the bias so they would stretch, and then I stretched it over the hemispheres, and I was able to tuck everything up underneath. So there's more or less no tucks on it, taking advantage of the stretch of the fabric. This technique works much better with stretch fabrics like a stretch velvet or a knit or spandex, but this is something that you can do that eliminates your layer lines very, very quickly because you're covering the whole thing. And because it's not a technique that's used often in competitive circles, you get points. So any questions? Okay. This is probably my absolute favorite. This is called pave style. Pave is an Italian word that I don't know what it means, but it's where you pack so many crystals into a singular space that you can't see what's underneath it. The single Pokeball on the left took me 9 hours of stoning. I just brushed an area with Aleene, is it Aleene? No, it's Beacon Gem Tack. And then I used a stoning pen. It's called a crystal katana. It's like a pen with a wax tip on it and then a metal tip on the other end so you can adjust it. But I just sat there going one by one, putting crystals into this glued area. And it's something that makes a lot of visual impact that's not used often because of the amount of time it takes. And you also don't have to sand any of your pieces, so you can just print it and then cover it in crystal, and judges really, really like that. And then airbrush weathering. This is also one of my absolute favorite techniques here. I use Createx brand, which is, they make multiple kinds of paint, but they make a transparent airbrush paint. And that's what I've used on the pauldron and the helmet here. Just like they're warm gray, transparent. The nice thing that I like about those particular paints is because they are a transparent base, you can mix them into any of the paint that you're using and you can create really smooth gradients. So if you look closely on this Obi-Wan pauldron, there's black gradients on the edges of the symbol only because I used a stencil, but then mixed in black transparent paint into my red to make more of a burgundy or an ox blood color, and I layered that up. The other thing though is that you always want to use a cool tone for this, because warm tone blacks will start to read as brown, and that just looks like dirty. And if that's the aesthetic you're going for, wonderful. But if you want like carbon scarring and charring, you need to use a cool tone for that. On these particular pieces for blaster bolts, which is something that a couple of people have asked me about, so I wanted to touch on it here, you basically just take your airbrush with your transparent paint, and then you make the circle the size of the blaster hole that you want, and you want it to be real good and juicy. You don't want to let this dry. And then you decide which direction the blaster bolt is going, and you drag it off in that direction multiple times, making a teardrop shape. And then before that area really has time to set, because you've layered the paint in the center portions, you take a paper towel and wipe it. And that takes all of the wet paint off and leaves the stuff on the edges that's dried. And so it leaves an organic edge with a feathered shape, and it makes it look very nice in my opinion. Any questions about that? Cool, all right. I think I've got 10 more minutes. Yeah. And then, when in doubt, just paint it. If you are spending time trying to make a competitive piece and you have dialed in your printer settings, but you don't have the time to really do all of these previous things that we've talked about, a well-done paint job can help bring your score up for a poorly finished prop. Both of these pieces here have 0 sanding on them. But because of the gradients and the masking and the detail painting, this would net you points in competition, as opposed to just like slapping some paint on or spray painting something. Like showing the judges that you've taken time to add detail even to something that may not be the best base will be impressive and garner their attention, and is something that you can point out and be like, I spent 12 hours painting a Sheikah slate from Breath of the Wild. Please pay attention to me. But do we have any questions about that? Yes, sir.
And what, for like PLA and stuff like that, what type of paints would you recommend using?
I really like Platfx brand, if only because those are formulated specifically to work well with 3D prints and fabric. There's some kind of like flexible additive that they put into it that also acts as a top coat. But in a pinch, if that's not available in the right colors, I like to use, what's it called? There's another kind of craft paint that's a chalk base. I think it's called, you know what? Come to my table, I'll remember what it is later and I'll talk to you about it. But it's, don't mind me being on my phone just a moment. Stay away from Apple Barrel, don't touch her. Folk art paint works really well. I have a couple of those that I like. But there's this one particular brand of paint that we basically only have Hobby Lobby in my area, and so that's where I do most of my like paint shopping.
Ceramico?
Yes, thank you. It's Ceramico. It uses a chalk base pigment, so when you put it on, you can sand it, and it will sand smooth almost like a body filler. But so between those two.
Okay.
So, any other questions? Okay. Okay, that's it. That's the panel. That's roughly 7 years of competitive experience in 3D printing boiled down into an hour. I know I kind of had to like skim the surface on some of it. But we've got 10 minutes. Do we have any more questions? You, sir.
So I think I went online and recently there's been some PLA that are specific for cosplay.
Yes.
Are those pretty good to use compared to like just regular PLA or anything?
They're not widely available enough that most people have gotten a hold of it. For the most part, those sample pieces have been sent to large influencer cosplayers, so I personally don't have experience with it. I can't remember who it was, but I've watched one review. She was one of the bigger cosplayers. It might have been Amber Arden, maybe? But though that particular, I think it's called Cos PLA, it's formulated to be easier to sand and lightweight and heat resistant, which all sound good in theory, but in execution I have no clue because that filament is not widely available yet. Yes, sir.
Trying to use some glue, like some Gorilla Glue on some of the pieces that have broke, but it seemed to eat through it and drip or puffed up like a...
Yeah, Gorilla Glue it turns into foam. It reacts to moisture and foams up.
But I mean, sometimes it'll, like I had this thing and I tried to glue it and I had it sitting where it's supposed to be, but the glue actually ate through the PLA to the bottom and then there's glue on the surface.
Okay,
So is there any kind of glue you think that would be better than to not eat it? Would be better?
Right. So there, again, I really like Bob Smith brand super glue, which is available on Amazon and most hobby shops. I use their purple bottle, which is the gap filling medium thickness. And that, because your print surface is never perfectly smooth, that gives you enough grip to hold your two pieces together. You can also use crazy glue, like people have had good success with crazy glue. Additionally, if you just want to like tack things in place and you have a spare soldering iron, people will take a soldering iron and then kind of like weld the seam of their two pieces together, and then that makes like a solid plastic union as opposed to relying on just the glue. I can't think of what the name of the chemical is off the top of my head right now, but PLA will fully dissolve in the presence of this particular chemical. Well, acetone will weaken it, but I can't remember exactly what it is. It's like an isopropyl something. It's not just regular IPA, but it's an isopropyl derivative that will smooth PLA in the same way that acetone does, but the only problem is that it leaves it gooey. It never truly sets up again like acetone and ABS does. So it's possible that your glue maybe had too much acetone or had too much of this one particular chemical in it, and that's why it ate through your print. It also sounds like maybe you don't have enough shell thicknesses in your print. So if you increase your vertical walls or shell thickness or like outside thick, that might help you attach your pieces together better. I guess the only other thing that I debated about talking about and then figured I would run out of time is printing with flexibles. The shoes that I'll have on Sunday, if you guys want to stop by my booth, are 3D printed shoes out of TPU flexible filament. It turns out that you can treat flexible filament like foam, like EVA foam. And so other than finding an appropriate glue that will work with it, that will flex, I like to weld it together with my soldering iron because I am insane. But you can take foam clay and silicone caulking like Quick Seal, and you can fill in your layer lines very, very quickly using foam clay and caulking and get finished like pieces that are ready to be plasti dipped and painted and flexible, and it's really cool. Yes?
This is more of like a competition judge question, but if I buy a file from a creator and I print it and do all the work on it, like I body shop it, whatever, do I still have to tell the judges that like I bought a pre-made file? Or?
Yes. So in some circles of competition, typically like national and worldwide circuit, you have to make your own files. That like, there's something about the concept of buying something and then pushing a button and having it made that really bothers large circuit cosplay judges. And so, one, you would need to properly credit that you did not make it, but also, like at Emerald City Comic Con and C2E2, Chicago Comic Expo, the big convention in Chicago every year, they require that you bring a flash drive with your 3D models on it so they can look at them and verify the metadata that you made them from scratch. If they look at your metadata and they catch that they do not match the information that they've given you, they will disqualify you on principle. So 3D printing in like Arizona stuff, like probably not that big of a deal if you were to buy a print or buy a file and then print it. But anything bigger than like a statewide competition, you absolutely need to make your files yourself. So, any other questions? Cool. Okay. Well, let's wrap it up. Again, my name is Jacob V. I go by Print Bash Props on Instagram. If you would like to talk to me further, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I love to talk to people about 3D printing and working through these kinds of things. And this hobby is dynamic, and so there's always new information coming out and experiments to be had. But thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I don't have a question, but I have an
Yeah.
anecdote.
Okay.
We made these.
Oh, wow.
We're cosplaying. He's going to do Kratos, and I'm going to do Through tomorrow.
That's so awesome.
And then we got here,